So today our lecture is on adaptive immunity. This is an extension of the general topic of our body's defenses that we started on Monday, where we talked about the innate immune response, specifically how innate immunity can be divided into generally a first and second line. The first line being barriers and mechanisms of removal of potential colonists and pathogens, and the second line being primarily mediated by immune cells, as well as certain blood components like complement, other antimicrobial substances, and processes such as inflammation and fever. So today we're going to see how the third line of defense works to protect the body in response to specific threats, which are not only identified and dealt with, but then allow the body to respond more quickly upon a second invasion. So this is why it's called acquired or adaptive immunity, and it's really composed or mediated almost exclusively by specialized lymphocytes. This has the components listed in a little bit different order than we'll be discussing them. We'll start with T cells and cell-mediated immunity, and then follow up with B cells, and those are the lymphocytes that produce the antibodies that you may be familiar with from some of the other exercises you've already done in your lab report on the immune system. So this table in your text compares some important aspects of both innate and adaptive immunity. You may be surprised to know that only vertebrates actually have adaptive immunity or anti-based adaptive immunity specifically. Again, the innate immunity, although it can target microbial components, does so in a non-specific manner. You may remember the PAMPs, or the pathogen-associated molecular patterns, and those are things common to most microbial types of microbes, and lipoteichoic acid, LPS, peptidoglycan were some examples of those. But in adaptive immunity, we'll see that the antigens, which are important in recognition, bind very specifically to their targets. The immune receptors in the case of adaptive immunity, we'll see our T cell receptors and antibodies, the antibodies produced by B cells. While in the innate immune response, we saw how toll-like receptors were membrane proteins that recognized the PAMPs and then responded by secreting immune modulators such as cytokines and interferons. The adaptive immunity involves only the lymphocytes, while innate immunity involves most other cells of the body, and you'll see these ideas in a little more detail as we go on here. So just to give you an overview of adaptive immunity in contrast to innate immunity, again, we're going to be recognizing distinct invaders and their products. Some attributes include not only specificity to certain antigens, but actually inducibility. So the response is induced or activated in response to a particular antigen that the body detects, and then that specific response is amplified. And in this process, many copies of the cells which serve to detect the invader are produced. A very important aspect of adaptive immunity is the fact that it needs to be self-tolerant, that does not react against the body's own proteins and products. And then this aspect of memory, that an outcome of adaptive immunity is that the body responds more quickly to repeat exposure. Just to remind you again of the different types of white blood cells, and just going to emphasize here that these lymphocytes are the topic of our discussion today. The rest of these being involved primarily in natural or innate immunity. One type of lymphocyte, if you remember, is the natural killer lymphocyte. That is part of the innate immunity. But the rest of them, specifically the B and T cells, all constitute part of that third line of defense or adaptive immunity. Let's see. Try to. Okay. So we made the point that we're talking specifically about activity of lymphocytes in adaptive immunity. B lymphocytes, oftentimes we just refer to as B cells, and T lymphocytes as T cells. The B and the T refer to where they mature. They're both, as you would know from the previous slide, originate in the bone marrow. The B lymphocytes also mature there, whereas the T lymphocytes travel to and mature in the thymus. And this is just a picture, move this up a little bit, showing the relative size, just about the size of a red blood cell, most of it being nucleus. And there's two types, in addition to two types of cells in adaptive immunity. We're going to look today at two specific types of responses. The first of these is referred to generally as cell-mediated immunity, and that is carried out by the T cells almost exclusively. And the second type of adaptive immune response involves the B cells, and this is the antibody-based or humoral immune response. Humoral. There, I said it. So that refers to humor or things, components within the blood. Okay, so what I've done is just insert into today's presentation all of the different animations that do accompany this topic in your text and in mastering. You may at this point want to stop and go look at the host defenses, the big picture, then continue with overviews. There's two presentations. These are pretty short, less than a minute, I think, of both cell-mediated immunity involving T cells. We'll see among the T cells there's two types of T cells, and then humoral immunity, the overview of that, just to kind of give you an idea of where we're going today. So before we talk about specifically how those types of cells work to protect our bodies from invading microbes, we need to look at the corresponding tissues, parts of the body that are involved in this type of immune response. Now, as the name implies, lymphocytes, these are cells that are present in the lymph and in the blood, primarily in the lymph. The composition of the lymph is much like blood plasma. This is a bodily fluid which leaks from the blood. You notice in this side picture here, there's capillaries which are carrying the red blood cells. The fluids, some of the fluid leaks out just normally in between those epithelial cells and endothelial cells, which is the term for cells that line the vasculature. The fluids then kind of pick up wastes and parts of microbes if present, sort of flushing the spaces between the cells, and then empty into the lymph vessels. And then just contraction of the skeletal muscles moves the lymph in a one-way direction to the heart via the lymphatic vessels. So this then returns to circulation at the heart, and the different parts of the lymphatic system include cells, tissues, and organs, which are all diagrammed here. The most important ones being the lymph nodes. Those are a part of what are known as the secondary lymphoid organs. The primary ones are just where the lymphocytes are produced and mature. So most of you are familiar with the fact that if you get sick, that your lymph nodes get swollen and feel kind of tender, and that's because they have a primary role of filtering the lymph as it's passing through the body on the way back to the circulatory system. And the lymph, the center part here kind of performs the filtering function, the medulla in the middle of the lymph node. And there's another area called the cortex, which is where B lymphocytes are present, and they will clonally amplify in response to activation. So other lymphatic tissues include the spleen. This is another primary residence of the B lymphocytes, tonsils, which normally sample bacteria and organisms that are present in the mouth. And remember this concept of mucus-associated lymphatic tissue. I think we brought this up. Seems to me we brought this up last lecture. But here's an example. Let's just go back to this previous slide. Here showing the Peyer's patches in the intestinal wall of the small intestine, actually. So those are involved also in adaptive immunity, and there's parts of that that represent an actual lymph tissue. Okay, so as we set up the scenario of protecting the body via adaptive immunity, we've covered then the important cells, the lymphocytes, the tissues that are involved. So now we're going to look at who are the bad guys. What is the system trying to protect us from? So whenever you hear in this lecture the term antigen, this really means something that's going to stimulate adaptive immunity. These are invaders. They're they're any really molecule that the body recognizes as being foreign. It doesn't belong, and it's worthy of attack. The body actually recognizes, in most cases, not the entire antigen. So an antigen refers really to the whole molecule. In this picture, here's a pathogen. You notice from just the illustration, it's a bacterium. The surface proteins here would represent antigens, but within even one antigen, here's an enlargement of that, there'll be several small different areas, and these are the epitopes that they're called. They're just little small portions of the antigen which actually interact with the immune cells. You'll notice, though, in the purpose of this lecture, that these two terms, antigen and epitope, are really used very commonly interchangeably. Again, think about them as it's something foreign, it's something that's alerting the body to a potential invasion or infection. So what kinds of things are antigens? Proteins make fantastic antigens. They're very antigenic, very good at stimulating the adaptive immune response. Other types of glycoproteins, sugars, can be good antigens. Lipids, not so much, but with respect to allergies, certain food and dust particles can also act as antigens. So the antigen, those are the foreign molecules that the body is going to mount a response to.